Well, hey, Jen.
Hey, Ellie.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for
Our
having me.
podcast. You are many things, Jen, but one of the things you are is our lead program counselor for our romance scam recovery group.
Yes.
Tell everybody why you're qualified and how long you've been with us, or your credentials.
I've been doing this for just over 4 years. I've been here from the very first group session that we've run. So it's been a really incredible journey, to meet all these really amazing people who have come through this group. My background is I'm a social worker. A lot of my training and my work has been working with people with trauma, working with people with grief and loss. So kind of within that, this cyber scam, romance scam, all of that really does fall kind of in the purview of that trauma, relationship issues. So, being able to use my background and my skills to help support people in a pretty unique way here.
Yeah. And you're amazing, if I do say so myself.
Oh,
You're also a doctor. I want to
I
emphasize that.
am.
You're a
Yes.
doctor.
Yes. I completed my doctorate and have been fortunate to use those skills to, do a lot of work to continue supporting people in their journey.
We are
Very
super lucky to
fortunate.
have you. Please don't ever leave us. Stay with us forever. Okay.
100%.
Yes. Now that I've done my begging, I'm going to start with the first question.
Perfect.
So, this is a big one. We talk about it often, but I feel like the general public, it's always good to hear this, right? So, how do scammers exploit emotional vulnerabilities? And why are these tactics so effective in creating that sense of trust, that sense of attachment?
Yeah, I start out each group by saying to people, these scammers are just so incredibly good at what they do, right? The amount of money they're able to move, the relationship they're able to build with people, it's really, an incredible operation that they have. Romance scammers really exploit those emotional vulnerabilities that, they carefully curate and manipulate psychological and social dynamics. They're able to build trust, they're able to create really deep emotional attachment, and they do it very, very quickly. Their tactics are effective because they tap into essentially like the fundamental human needs for love, companionship, and validation, right? When we think about relationships, those are the three big buckets. you know they definitely have tactics that we've been able to follow and track, both kind of with our data and with stories from the people that we support through this. I think the big piece that we always talk about with this is that grooming and emotional manipulation, right? Tactics they use, like, love bombing. They overwhelm their victims with affectionate messages, with compliments, with declarations of love, and pretty early on in the relationship, right? And that creates this like really intense emotional bond to somebody. The other piece that we hear about and we know that they do is that mirroring, right? And how good does it feel, to meet somebody who has the exact same interests as you, right? The exact same religious background, the exact same goals, your values, your emotions, really doing their best to make the connection feel uniquely personal and almost destined, right? How many people say, I felt like, I met my soulmate, or I felt like this was meant to be, because we were so connected in that way. And then, thinking about how they paint this really idealized vision of a shared future, marriage, travel, this life together, right? Something that I find myself saying to people is, you wouldn't have invested in this relationship if you didn't see a future together with somebody. Um,
Yeah, I
yeah.
think too, people underestimate the manipulation, right? Something that came up, it's come up a few times in the sessions we run with participants, right? The scammer will pull away suddenly, right?
Yes.
It's love, 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 love. I love you. I can't get enough of you. And then all of a sudden they sort of grow a little bit cold. And it's all a tactic to make the person think, what's going on? Why don't you love me as much as you did, 2 weeks ago? What's happened? What's
Yeah.
changed? And they almost become desperate. I hate to use that word, but very
Absolutely.
motivated, right, to get
Yeah.
that connection back. And that is oftentimes when the scammer will ask for the money, right? And say, "Oh, I'm
Absolutely.
just so distracted right now because things are so busy.
Hmm.
This is terrible stuff is going on at work." Da, 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 da. The story comes in, and
Yeah.
then the money ask, and the person is almost too happy to help because they're just like, "Oh my gosh, I want it to go back to the way it was."
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
interesting.
thinking about like
Yeah.
how they exploit those psychological vulnerabilities, right? A lot of people that we talk to, there's loneliness and isolation, right? A lot of these people have experienced emotional hardship. They've had a breakup, they've had a loss or the death of a long-term partner or companion in a lot of situations, or, even just social isolation, making them even more receptive to that attention, right? And again, victims often feel this sense of obligation to reciprocate the scammers, apparent kindness and commitment, right? This person hasn't given me any reason to believe that they're not who they say they are. They're not going to do what they say they do. So I'm going to let down my guard and give them this money, right? And like you talked about, kind of they create this fear of loss, they create this urgency, this crisis, you know, making people feel like, if they fail to act, by sending money, it will destroy the relationship, like everything this person has built with them, and that's where we see how they've really built this trust to then request money or favors, right? Sometimes it's small requests, then leading to larger ones, asking for a small loan, a few dollars, oh, my wallet's locked in my car and I need somebody to come open it. Can you, send me just a little bit of money? And then kind of it grows from there, right? And again, those kind of crisis scenarios really heighten people. And, the people that we talk to, the people in our groups are just, they're inherently good, kind people and they want to
Yeah.
help, right? So, like you
Yeah.
said, it's like, we're almost just kind of waiting to help somebody in that way. Like, this person's so far away. I care about them. I want to give them this money.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
a good person, right? I'm a good
Yes.
person, I help people, and yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. I do think there is such a spectrum. I think, one of our participants also brought up, everybody thinks that romance fraud victims are desperate and they were desperately looking for love and attention. And I think that sometimes that is the case, the loneliness, right? You've
Hmm.
mentioned you and I have hear weekly, right? I was so lonely. I was so
Yes.
sad. They came into my life when I was in this place. But we often also hear, I was just dipping my toe in the dating waters, or
Hmm.
I was fine, right? I
Yeah.
was just kind of
Yep.
fine. And but the scammer they study us, right? They know where you're at.
Absolutely.
And so they say, "Oh, we're just friends, right? We're just acquaintances."
Hmm.
And they just persist, right? They persist until
Absolutely.
they can build that relationship. So the spectrum of it doesn't matter. You could be elated and happy and fine, or you could be very lonely and very sad. The scammer will figure out where you are and just weasel in any way they can.
Absolutely. And that's why we talk about, like, everybody, is vulnerable to this, right? Scammers don't discriminate. They kind of find those pieces in people, and, the tactics they use are just so effective regardless of your education level, regardless of your relationship status, all these things they really exploit, they manipulate the neurochemistry, right? That creating that rush of dopamine, that
Yeah.
oxytocin, from that perceived affection. It reinforces attachment. It makes people emotionally invested, right? They manufacture that in people. We as humans just have certain cognitive biases, right? This kind of sunk cost fallacy, right? It makes us reluctant to abandon the relationship after they've already, invested time,
Yeah.
emotions,
Yeah.
money, and then they prey upon that shame and social pressure. They isolate people, they say, oh, your family won't understand, your friends don't understand what we have, it's so special.
Yeah.
If victims are already kind of isolated, they're probably even more hesitant to report the scams. They're embarrassed. It kind of further entrenches them in this deception. So, thinking about, why those tactics are so effective, and, again, it can impact anybody,
Yeah.
without kind of having that education and background to kind of know or to see, certain pieces of the scam.
And that really brings me into my next question, and this is something that we deal with again weekly. It can be very challenging to pull someone out of this situation. They are just deep in this romance fraud. So I know we kind of touched on it, the relationship building, right? The emotional manipulation. Those are those key points why it can be so hard to pull someone out of this. And then you hit on another thing. They will say, your friends, your family, they don't understand. Why do they hate love? Right? They're
Hmm.
just
Exactly.
jealous, right?
Yeah.
They're just jealous of your situation. Are there any other key points you want to bring up on why it can be so hard to pull someone out of these crimes?
Yeah, I always think about how this scammer has created this really deep emotional and psychological and even kind of cognitive barriers, right? And that's what makes it so challenging, right? They have this strong emotional bonds. Again, this fear of loss, this attachment they created. They use those psychological manipulation and really kind of that cognitive dissonance too. And this is what we hear in group and from participants, right? When reality kind of contradicts their belief in relationships, people try to
Yeah.
rationalize inconsistencies rather than accept, what is often a very painful truth in that. And I think we hear that kind of week after week. When people share their stories again, and thinking about that social isolation, that shame and embarrassment, how they manipulate people through this urgency, these emergencies, and often too, kind of along with that, they often paint their victim as like the hero, right? Oh my gosh, you saved me, you're my savior,
Yeah.
thank God you were here. It puts the person responsible, for helping their partner out of trouble, right? And that feels so good to help somebody we care about, but also kind of they build this, bigger kind of savior piece in us, right? Kind of putting us on that pedestal in the relationship.
Yeah,
Um,
I've read, and I'm not a doctor, you're the doctor, so you can fix me if I'm wrong. But I've read we almost connect more with people when they ask us for help and we help
Absolutely.
them, right? That it almost like increases, I think it's oxytocin, again,
Hmm.
not a doctor. But it jives it in our brain and it amps it in our brain. And that's exactly what they're doing, right? Please, you're my only hope, right? Help me. And boom, they're solidifying the connection and they're
Yes,
getting money, right? It's a double
absolutely.
win for the scammer, which is heartbreaking. Okay, Jen, if I'm a friend or a family member of someone who is deep in a romance fraud, what's your advice? What can I do? Where do I start?
I'll just start by saying, helping a loved one kind of escape or leave this romance scam, it's really delicate and it's really challenging. You know, on one hand, kind of the wrong approach can push them further into denial. Well, on the other hand, the right approach can really gradually open their eyes to the truth. So
Yeah.
thinking about, how to support somebody, the number one thing we always say is to approach with empathy and not judgment. Victims are often embarrassed, ashamed, defensive. Maybe they're starting to see the red flags, but it's again like a really painful truth for them to see that this person they've invested everything in isn't who they said they were. We hear from victims who say, people will say, how could you fall for this? How could you be so stupid? How could you be so gullible? Right. So thinking about approaching people, I know you really care about this person. I want to understand the relationship better. Tell me a little bit more, about what's going on. Or, I'm worried. I've seen similar situations or I've read about them, or I have a friend who's been in a situation where somebody was deceived. Can we talk about what this looks like? So I think a lot of it is showing concern rather than trying to prove them wrong. I always talk to people, family members or friends, ask open ended questions, right? Some of the things that we talk about, and how to tell if somebody, might be a scammer. Have you ever video chatted with them? Have you met them in person? Why do you think they can't meet you in person? Has anybody
Yeah.
else ever asked you for money like this? Almost that kind of like Socratic questioning, trying to have them arrive at their own answer rather than forcing them to accept yours. It's really
Yeah.
hard. Yeah. We hear from victims, some family members come almost like an intervention with concrete evidence, like I reverse image search and here's what they sent you and here's all these other ones online that are scams or fakes. Some people pull news reports saying like, here are all the red flags that are listed in this article and here's everything I'm hearing from you and it matches perfectly. And it can be really hard. And I think, for people, family, friends to understand that this might be more of, them having to have some patience, persistence, and compassion. People often don't end this relationship immediately or just overnight, but I think it's really important to have that open communication to present facts gently and to offer people a way out, right? Because I think that's important too. Words like, if this does turn out to be fake or a scam, I want you to know that I'm here to help you and we'll be here to support you no matter how this relationship goes, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about kind of the words we use and how we, approach people and we're approaching them because we care about them. So I think remembering that kind of at the core is panicked or alarmed or worried as we might be, really approaching them with that compassion.
Yeah, and it absolutely takes a lot of patience because you can understand how family and friends would be so frustrated. But I've heard you mention this a few times, and Also, Debbie Deem, who is another pioneer in the victim service
Yes.
field with regard to financial fraud victims, she and you have often offered like, hey, make a promises kept versus promises not kept
Mhm.
list. Like, right, this is all the stuff they told you they were going to do for you, give you. Has it happened yet? And that's an easy way to kind of put it in front of their face, right? But then
Definitely.
give them the grace and the time to digest it themselves. You almost have to, like Brene Brown, right, says you have to go in the pit with them. That's what
Yes,
empathy really is. You go in the pit and the uncomfortableness with them. And that's hard to do. It's
it
really
really
hard to
is.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Jen. So, next question. Why do we have the case of people being affected by scams repeatedly, right? Even after experiencing something as, completely painful and devastating as a romance fraud, we often see, not often, but we sometimes see people, this is their third or fourth romance fraud. Why does that happen?
It's interesting, right? With a lot of scams or, even thinking about other types of relationships that are emotionally or physically abusive, right? We see people, kind of in these patterns. We know that people who are victimized are at higher rate for re-victimization. And that's why I think this kind of group model that we run is so important, right? People get the education piece and the peer support piece. But, thinking about people who, might be scammed repeatedly, even after kind of acknowledging, oh, I was scammed in this way before, but then it happened to me again, and then it happened to me again, or a different type of scam happened, right? You know, Thinking about this mix of psychological, emotional, and situational factors, right? Scammers, again, are just so good at exploiting vulnerabilities, cognitive bias, and past traumas too. It makes certain people more susceptible over time rather than less. Thinking about how people, as humans, we have these deep emotional needs, thinking about our family, our community. We get out of one scam. Do we have support? Do we have people to lean on so that we're talking about our relationship so that we're not then, matching with somebody who is re-victimizing us again, right? People talk about how they're people pleasers, people who struggle with setting boundaries, who fear saying no. How many times have we heard people say, well, it was better to have just someone to talk to
Hmm.
than no one to talk to, right?
Hmm.
So thinking about,
Absolutely.
you know, low self-esteem, if people are doubting their worth, they might be more drawn to affection even when it seems suspicious. And again, maybe they're more willing to continuously overlook that. Some of it is trauma bonding and manipulation tactics. Scammers use intermittent reinforcement, right? They use the psychological tactic where they mix that affection with emotional withdrawal. They keep the victim almost addicted to seeking their approval, right? People will say, I just couldn't get enough. I was waiting by my phone for that call or that message from somebody. Like I couldn't focus on anything else. Really creating this trauma bonding. The victim feels emotionally attached to their abuser, even when they're harmed and even when they can acknowledge that. You know, Oftentimes we see that victims subconsciously seek out those familiar patterns, and that's where I see people, when I talk about people being re-victimized in this way, our brain associates manipulation with love at that point. So it makes future scams feel emotionally familiar, right? And if people don't have that education or they haven't done that work maybe in therapy, if they're feeling that familiar connection, they might not be associating, oh, well, it was with something suspicious or bad or abusive or traumatic. It's making me feel good because it's familiar, even though deep down it's not actually making them feel good. Um,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, and you brought up the addiction piece, and that reminded me of how several times in group we've heard someone say something to the effect of, "I am or was addicted to sending the money," right? Even when
absolutely.
I had accepted that this was a criminal, this was a bad guy, I was still addicted to the communication and addicted to sending the
Yeah,
money, and I that really speaks to one, this is absolutely a relationship, right? The scammer is lying to them,
100%.
but it is a relationship and they are going through a breakup and a breakup takes time. You just don't say, oh, well, the breakup's done. I feel better. Let's go out and find a new one, right? Like it takes time. And that can be the frustrating part too when we go back to friends, family, anyone who's in the victim's life, right?
Hmm.
It can be frustrating. Yeah.
Absolutely. And some of that too makes me think of like the cognitive bias and denial in that, right? We think about people who
Mhm.
are
Mhm.
re-victimized or who continue to be victimized. Part of it is that optimism bias, right? Like this one's different. The last person was a scammer, but this new love interest is real, right?
Yeah.
Or even like that sunken cost fallacy. Well, I've invested so much into the relationship. I'm like 99% sure it's a scam, but what if 1%, like, what if that
Yeah.
1% is real and I'm going to get my money back, or this person really is real, right? Kind of
Yeah.
along with that confirmation bias, focusing on signs that the relationship's legitimate, ignoring those. Each scam like really rewires thinking. It makes people believe they can like spot a scammer. Well, scammers just continue to evolve their tactics, right? And we see that in group with the education piece we do, from the just over 4 years ago when we started to now, how much technology has advanced.
Yeah.
These
Yeah.
networks are really sophisticated. That people are targeted repeatedly. They're put on these victims lists that are sold and shared among scam networks. We've heard people talk about different scams like related to it, of recovery scams. People promising to get their money back while really just stealing more money from this person, right? But thinking about how a victim might be in that state of desperation, like, I need this money, this was my entire nest egg, my retirement, my loved ones pension, all this money that I gave away, my children's inheritance. And how easy it is for these kind of associated scammers to really step in, to promise that they can help, to promise to get the money back, and then again they're just another scammer.
Yeah, and you brought 2 really good points up. The first one, hope, and the second one, technology, right? So when we think of, even if they're starting to think it isn't a scam, right?
Mhm.
What's the alternative? Oh my gosh, right? We talked about this several
Yeah.
times where really, okay, we break them out of prison, right? We break them out of the scam, but effectively we're leading them to a desert or rough seas. And we're like,
Hmm.
you're welcome, right? We
Right.
got you out of the
Yep.
scam. But now you have this terrible one. You're going through a breakup, right? You
Hmm.
realize your money has been stolen. You are not going to get it back. There are
Yeah.
little to no recovery options, right? If I am a victim, I'm going to be like, oh, maybe I take my chances with this
Hmm.
person, that maybe
Absolutely.
they're just like a bad person and not in a transnational crime ring, right?
Hmm.
But
Right.
unfortunately, they often are. And then the tech piece, again, I think I've heard many times, well, I did a search, I couldn't find anything, right? Because
Hmm.
the scammer has just created a completely different person using AI and ChatGPT. Also, they spoke to me in French and German,
Hmm.
and, it fits their story. But again, ChatGPT, the internet, you can do all of this. They can be whoever they
Anything.
want. They can
Hmm.
sound however they want to sound. And now we have cryptocurrency with, man, that's every scammer's dream. Once it's
Oh
sent,
yeah.
it's gone, right?
Hmm.
It's gone. So yeah, those are two really important pieces you brought up. So I want to get into peer support really quick, because that's what our program is. It's peer support. So in your opinion, what role does peer support play in the recovery process for fraud victims? And how does it kind of differ from, I don't know, just one-on-one therapy? Where's it good? Where's it bad? Do you use both at the same time? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thinking about how you said kind of we take people out of this relationship and then what are they left with, right? They're already isolated, they're already feeling shame and embarrassment. So I think peer support plays like an incredibly crucial role with helping, romance fraud victims heal. It provides this really unique layer of both emotional, psychological recovery, and that differs from individual therapy. So, professional therapy focus on, structured mental health interventions. Peer support offers relatability, validation, and really a sense of belonging, right? Something that I say to people every week is that while our stories are different, you are among people where there is no judgment because everybody's been through something very, very similar. So thinking about how we reduce shame and isolation, just hearing from other people and saying, oh my gosh, that happened to me too. I thought I was the only one, right? Or I spent so long thinking I was stupid and gullible, but now to hear that, somebody with the same background, education, values, thoughts as me was scammed too, it makes me feel like I'm not alone, right? Just hearing I've been there too can be so powerful and
So
validating.
powerful. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Shared experience is so important. And that's where it differs from therapy. And as a therapist myself as well, I think that these two really do go hand in hand, right? I think there's a lot of people who are at the point and have done a lot of their own work to be in this peer support group. And I think there are people who could really benefit from, doing both kind of at the same time, thinking about how we rebuild trust, how we use some practical recovery strategies. Therapy is really important for helping that deep emotional processing of trauma, right? A lot of people come to us because they experienced a big loss or grief, often of a partner, a long term partner, a loved one, a child, even. So, having somebody who can really help you process through that trauma, that grief, and loss is hugely important. The second piece of that cognitive restructuring, right? And that prevents future manipulation. So, having somebody one on one who can help, work with you through that to kind of build those skills that you need essentially for this. And again, addressing trust and self-worth issues, right? For a lot of people, self-esteem, self-worth is deeply rooted from maybe childhood or other losses they've had. So ensuring that people kind of have that piece of traditional therapy, I think, is hugely important. So I really do see them go hand in hand. And especially with this group, this population, I think there's so much stigma and shame around this crime anyways, that being able to bring people together with this peer cohort is so important. It really does provide this, I'll say, safe space for people to start engaging in that conversation. And we've had people go through our program a number of times, right? Kind of session after session, because they were in all different places. And maybe the second or third time they go through, they're more at a place where they can use some of the resources, or they can engage more with their peers. Whereas they're coming in the first time, maybe they're still talking to their scammer, they're kind of just realizing what's going on. So I think it's hugely important to have kind of both of those pieces. But I do think that peer support really provides that sense of belonging, that shared wisdom, and really real time healing. We see it over the course of 10 weeks, which is, not long at all in the course of recovery. But, just seeing how people change, and really how they grow and heal in that very short amount of time, I think is huge, and something that traditional therapy alone really doesn't fully achieve, especially kind of in that time frame.
Yeah, and I think you again brought up a great point with the people we see that repeat, right? And they will say, the first time I went through, I I just wasn't there, right? I had the brain fog. It's a trauma, right? As you said, it's a
Absolutely.
trauma, and so they have the brain fog. They can be very depressed, very sad, right? So things are kind of bouncing off them, right? It's not sinking in. And part of our group, as you mentioned, we give some cyber tips because, I mean, all of their information sometimes is now on the dark web and they're getting
Mhm.
bombarded by these other scammers, right? Or even the same scammer who's just changed their face, their
Mhm.
appearance, right? And so we're trying to prevent this re-victimization, like you said, which is a huge problem with this community because all their information is out there. So that
Mhm.
second or third time around, they're actually absorbing, oh my gosh, right? I need to freeze my credit. Oh my gosh, I need to do this, right? All those steps. So I do think it is. I think it's great. If you need to repeat, please repeat, right? We welcome that so you can get all that cyber
Absolutely.
and the important mental health piece to it.
Mhm.
Okay, so Jen, the long-term psychological effects that victims of romance fraud tend to experience, what are they? And again, kind of how can therapy or peer support kind of combat those? And you touched on this a little already.
Yeah, I will say, victims of romance scams often have lasting psychological effects, long after the scam has ended. You know, these scams impact people's self-esteem, their ability to trust, their relationships, and just overall mental health. So, while peer support doesn't replace professional therapy, again, that's where I see it being a very powerful tool in helping people, just process their experience, rebuild their confidence, and find that sense of community. I think thinking about some of those long-term psychological effects, that chronic shame and self-blame, right? That kind of deep-rooted embarrassment, the shame for being deceived. Maybe they blame themselves for not seeing red flags. They're feeling that social stigma, worrying that people view them as gullible or naive, even people in their family, even people who have been really supportive, right? It's kind of that deep seated feeling that we have. So, again, helping people normalize that, I think, is really important and a big part of what our group does. Now, the other piece I think about with long-term effects, PTSD and emotional triggers. Not everybody, but some victims develop PTSD. Thinking about how prolonged emotional manipulation and abuse impacts people. We definitely see some people come through with some starting symptoms of acute stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. So, again, ensuring people have the proper support, with therapy, with programs to really address a lot of those is really important for that. Certain words, situations, even online interactions, can trigger those distressing memories. Or we hear people say, I'm not ready to get back on social media, or, I saw an email pop up from some social media site, and a wave of, guilt and nausea and fear came over me. You know, People talk a lot about having anxiety, or even having panic attacks when they, are encountered with things that remind them of the fraud. So, thinking about how people are able to process kind of all of those triggers. And the other big thing I think is, thinking about the loss of trust in others, right? We hear from
Yeah.
people, week after week after week, and how can you trust anybody, right? I thought I knew this person so well. How can I trust myself to engage in any relationship? Have I spent my whole life, you know, unsure of what I'm doing, or how can I trust any new relationship, both romantic or platonic? We see people become socially withdrawn, worrying that they're going to be manipulated again, or people kind of overcorrect and they're hyper vigilant, they're overly
Yeah.
skeptical, which again makes it difficult to build genuine connections. So, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah. I was gonna
that
bring that up
it's
too, that
tough.
hypervigilance, right? Which is
Hmm.
the, like, now I can't trust anything, anyone, not even
Yeah.
myself. Yeah, I'm
Yes.
frozen. I am frozen in
Absolutely.
time. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
so important.
And all that leads to, thinking about like depression, loss of self-worth. I'm unlovable, how could I even be worthy of love if I was, so stupid to fall for this? And the other big piece that we hear, is people who have suicidal thoughts because of this, right? They've lost everything, they're facing having to sell their home, or they're being kicked out of their home, they gave away their child's investment, their retirement, they're facing having to go get a job in their elder years, all these things, that really impact people in that way. And again, just kind of speaks to the importance of people being able to find supportive community, people who can help support them through this really difficult piece, because we know that these effects are long lasting. So again, thinking about how, the peer support group plays a part in that. Well, it can't fully heal deep trauma or undo financial loss. If only we had a magic wand to be able to fix all that. Thinking about how it plays a critical role in that recovery. Again, practical tools for moving forward, both, on the cyber education piece, so that people are vigilant but not hyper vigilant, and that people are aware of, kind of that building back trust and sense of community and validation, with peers who really truly do get it.
Absolutely, and it's a long process, right? And everybody's different. You say this often. Your journey is your journey, right? Your
Hmm.
recovery journey is your journey, and it's not going to look like anyone else's. And you're going to go
Absolutely.
through all the emotions, and that's okay. And when
Hmm.
you're feeling it, and go with it, right? So,
Yep.
so important to know that. Jen, we're gonna do like a quick round of fun questions.
Oh,
This
all
this is
right.
the fun round. All right. Or
Okay.
or maybe not so fun. I don't know. We'll see. All right. What is the best day you've ever had while doing this work?
Ooh, best day I've ever had while doing this work. It would probably be one of the very first groups that we ran, right? I went into it being like, okay, we have this small cohort of people. What's it going to be like? Are people going to be talkative? It's all remote. It's kind of this weird internet. People are victimized on the internet, so they're a little
Yeah.
hesitant to engage on the internet at times. And I think it was our second session where somebody who didn't speak at all the first session had their camera off, came on camera and said, I'm finally feeling brave enough to name what happened to me. And for me, that was such a powerful moment. And that's a moment that
Yeah.
I think back on a lot when I think, how there are so many victims. How can we provide more support? Like, how can we meet the need for everybody who needs it? Right. And sometimes I think back and it was just that one person, taking this big step to say, now I can name what I've been through.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a really great moment.
That's a good day. That's a good
Yeah,
day.
definitely.
All right. Contrastly, what's the worst
Oh,
day? What's the worst day you've had?
oh. I mean, I would say there's a number of them that kind of tie for the worst day. And I think for me, one of the worst days is when I hear that somebody has gone back and given more money to their
Mhm.
scammer
Mhm.
after being, out of it for maybe, a few weeks, a few months. And then to just hear the pain where they talk about how they were lonely, they were
Yeah.
isolated. And again, talking to somebody was better than talking to nobody all day. And just kind of that pain really sits with me with people, right? We have this epidemic of loneliness in our society. And so hearing that story is, for me, I'm like, okay, what can we be doing to support people, kind of outside of all this to build community and support, especially for people in isolated communities, seniors, people with medical issues where they can't get out and go join a rec sports league. It's hard to make friends as an adult. So how do we do that? But those stories always, I would say those are some of the worst days, to hear the sadness and the desperation and just how hurt people are in that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it really speaks to how you have to address that vulnerability that the scammer took advantage of, right? And we all got it. We all got a vulnerability, right? It's
Mhm.
nobody's immune. But,
Absolutely.
if it was loneliness, right, we got to nip that in the bud.
Hmm.
Bud. It's bud.
but
Um,
but
we got to nip it in the bud. Otherwise, that the door is still cracked, right? The door
yeah,
is still cracked
absolutely.
open. What's something that you've gotten really good at as a result of doing this work?
I would say I've gotten really good at keeping up with trends for the cyber education piece, right? I always tell people like this group is so unique because we do cyber education. I say to people, you have so much more cyber education knowledge than almost any other just
Yeah,
kind of
that like
regular,
everybody. Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Right? I mean, we have people come through our group who are IT specialists who, in theory, I would think would know these different tactics of scammers and how they exploit technical vulnerabilities and not to click on a link you don't know or open a picture, something like that, right? But we know that there's not that education really anywhere else. Where else can you go to learn that? We don't teach it in school. We don't talk about it just kind of in life. This is a place where people learn that. And for me, I've done a lot of learning about that. And I think that's hugely important, right? Because we have this kind of compassion, empathy piece and pairing it with that. So for me, learning the cyber education, but also really, even more just how to sit with people who are in pain. And I think that's hard as a therapist. That was part of my training. That's what I do day in and day out. And thinking about the group and just how there's so much pain at times from everybody, right? Everybody's here because they've gone through a painful experience. So being able to really sit and support people through that has been really just a privilege for me to be a part of people's journey in that way.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that cyber piece is so critical, and even if you've had cyber education, you get it once a year, twice a year at your
Mhm.
workplace maybe, it only lasts a couple months, and you really need to stay on top
Yeah,
of things. Again, especially today, right? Things are changing. We're gonna have holograms coming after us.
right.
That's my one example I keep saying
I
over and
mean,
over again.
really though, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, you really need to stay on top of it, and I
Mhm.
think, our group, we have that forum, right, where we're, like, updating as much as we can.
Yeah.
Um, but and you brought up a great point too with you're just bringing up all these great points, Jen. With you could be an IT expert, cybersecurity expert, but again, it's that emotional manipulation piece, right? So we can have all the prevention technology in the world, but this is still going to
Yes.
happen. We need to do all of it. We need to hit the
Mhm.
emotional manipulation piece and being aware of ourselves. Self awareness is something humans really suck at, right? And then
Yep.
we have to be aware of the latest technology.
Yes.
Okay, who is going to save us? Who's going to save us from this problem? Who's going to fix everything? Is it government? Is it nonprofits? Is it tech companies? Is it I don't know. Somebody I don't know. Who's going to save us, Jen?
I think that we are going to save ourselves. I think it is going to take a strong collective voice of people speaking up. We talk a lot about the importance of reporting your scam, right? Because data matters, numbers matter. Those are what speaks to government funding, to, getting donations to nonprofits, to, funding like you said, technology changes all the time. So funding education and support opportunities for people, right? I think it takes us to be that voice, and thinking about how we encourage people to share their stories, and that doesn't mean they go out there and put their name and face on their full story. It could be anything. It could be writing to your local elected officials and saying, I know this is happening to somebody in your community. You don't have to say it's you if you're not comfortable with that, but I think it's going to take people using their voice to really put this out there, to educate our peers. I think those grassroots efforts are hugely important. And I think at the end of the day, it is going to be us who saves ourselves, hopefully with some support and help of the government, of, tech companies, to, some of these platforms, some of the platforms where the scams are happening, people taking that kind of social responsibility seriously and giving back and putting into the community to ensure that this isn't happening.
Yeah, we certainly need more resources, right? We need more global collaboration. We need more
Absolutely.
transparency between agencies, businesses, governments,
Hmm.
to more effectively act on the reporting data. I saw a statistic the other
Absolutely.
day. I think it was the World Economic Forum that 0.05% of all cybercrime reports are acted on. And then
Yeah.
when they are acted on, right, it takes years to create a case. You need
Hmm.
multiple people, you need the data, you need the forensics, right? And some victims, unfortunately, have passed away by the time
Absolutely. Yeah.
their
Yep.
case gets seen, and that's not justice, right? That's
Mm-mm.
unacceptable.
Not at all.
So,
Yeah.
all right, last question, Jen. If you had a magic wand, you mentioned that magic wand earlier, but now you've got it. I've given it to you. You could fix one thing, and it can't be giving someone or getting someone their money back because that's what
Ooh.
everyone would want, right? What would you fix? What's on the top of your list?
I think at the root of it, I would fix loneliness. Loneliness, and that leads to increased self-esteem, increased sense of self-worth, more positive mental health and well-being, self-care. And in my mind, that trickles down to everything else, right? To being able to say, no, this isn't healthy, this isn't working for me, and end in relationships when you feel something is a little weird. It helps you build positive, healthy relationships with people in your family or your community, whoever is a safe person for you. So in my mind, that would trickle down and fix a lot of things.
I think that's a great answer. Thank you so much, Jen. You're the
Appreciate it.
best. Yeah. I'll see you this
Thank
week.
you.
All right.
You are.